Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second day of the 15th International Sakharov Conference. Welcome to the newcomers, both here and online. So this morning we have a session on the human factor. And without disrespect for the speakers of yesterday, this is the cherry on the cake. You probably saw yesterday the showdown in the White House with South African President Ramaphosa. So this is exactly what we are discussing this morning, right? So we have 6 top experts on the program, 3 in the panel and 3 on keynote. And unfortunately, 2 of them were not able to be here. Lord David Owen, because of health reasons, and Simon Baron-Cohen because he had to be in the United States. So we will start with Lord David Owen. He's a doctor by training, was neurology and psychiatric registrar at St. Thomas Hospital in London, then entered politics in the Labour governments, was a Navy minister, health minister, and foreign secretary. Then he set up the Social Democratic Party, was its leader twice. He served as the EU peace negotiator in former Yugoslavia. He went to the House of Lords, and he's the first Lord in history who stepped down as a Lord because of age. He has been long interested in the interrelationship between politics and medicine, has written extensively on the subject, and 2 of his most famous books are In Sickness and in Power, Illness in Hands of Government, Military and Business since 1900, and then Hubris, the Road to Donald Trump Power, Populism and Narcissism. Lord Owen.
I'm particularly sorry not to be with you in Vilnius for such an interesting and timely conference. Yesterday, I know the conference concentrated on geopolitical issues, and in particular, the consequences of the war in Ukraine. Today's proceedings under the umbrella of the conference title, Pulling Back from the Abyss, is devoted to the human factor and whether we are our own worst enemy. Within this context, I will address the theme of hubris and what so often follows in its wake, nemesis. Too often, history shows through incompetence or inadvertence, we are our own worst enemies. Certainly at the moment, 2 world leaders in particular, President Putin and President Trump, are taking us to the abyss. The 2 leaders' individual characteristics are, in my judgment, playing havoc with what used to be, by and large, a rules-based world order. But whilst they share similarities, these leaders, there are also many differences. Now, hubris is not a medical term, I should stress this. Its most basic meaning, developed in ancient Greece, was simply a description of an act. A hubristic act was one in which a powerful figure, puffed up with overweening pride and self-confidence, treated others with insolence and contempt. Now, this word contempt is important. Look for contempt as part of any hubristic intoxication of power. And if you find it, then that's pretty definitely hubris. Power needs a certain measure of humility to be effective. And we should all remember Lord Acton's famous dictum when he warned, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. In 2009, I co-authored an article in Brain, the main journal of neurology around the world, I think, studying US presidents and UK prime ministers, and it was entitled Hubris Syndrome an acquired personality disorder. I've since tended to advocate the term trait rather than disorder, because I don't want to give too much of a medical emphasis to it. We identified hubris syndrome in this brain article as instances where leaders who have hitherto been regarded as normal, but whose personality had changed. Now, we identified hubris syndrome in this article in people who were leaders but had been regarded as normal, but whose personality, people watching, appeared to have changed as a consequence of being in power. Now, undoubtedly, some of the characteristics associated with hubris are beneficial and actually help make leaders more effective. But problems come when self-belief and self-confidence become excessive, and clearly so, to the serious detriment of good governance. Typical behavior in such individuals include a disproportionate concern for their own personal image, a messianic manner, if you like, exaggerated self-confidence, bordering on feeling omnipotent. Contempt for the advice or criticism of others is often there, impulsiveness, and at times a loss of contact with reality. Decision-making, as a consequence, goes awry, and hubristic incompetence results, and has been called that by myself and quite a number of others. I will leave more details about the toxic nature of the behavioral symptoms of hubris syndrome to your next speaker, Eugene Sadler-Smith, with whom I've worked closely over the years in our joint efforts to raise awareness of hubris syndrome in public and business life and to encourage interdisciplinary research. It is significant. In recent years, there have been calls for hubris syndrome to be included in the classification systems. And personally, I think that time has come and it ought to be done now. In 2018, I wrote Hubris, the Road to Donald Trump, Power, Populism, Narcissism, with an updated paperback version in 2020. President Trump's first election in November 2016 had prompted me to review all that I had written about past presidents and British prime ministers in relation to hubris. The book examined Trump's methods and argued that there were more disadvantages than advantages to his leadership style and content, some of them potentially very damaging. Well, we've seen some of those, and each of us will have our own judgments about that. The beginning of Trump's second term, which saw him ignite a global trade war with the steepest tariffs in a whole century, illustrates why I had reservations about Trump. Trump's second term win draws on the MAGA constituency, Make America Great Again. I've always argued that Trump does not have the medical diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. That diagnosis only exists in America and where American medical influence is strong. It does not exist in Britain, and it does not exist in Europe. What is undoubtedly true is that Trump is a world-class narcissist. There's not much we can teach him about narcissism. And it is getting progressively worse. with an overweening ego and self-confidence in all that he does. One of the symptoms of hubris syndrome is a narcissistic propensity to see their world primarily as an arena in which to exercise their power and seek glory for themselves. Trump's schooling was at a military academy in New York. It was not without controversy, and he showed early signs of playing by his own rules. His business career involved much stress, with bankruptcies and the search for new funds, which at an early stage involved Russia. And there's no doubt there is a long relationship of Trump with Russian finance in New York. And people forget that Russia has a mafia link to New York, and money links have existed for many decades. Some of those links were verified by the US Special Counsel, Robert Mueller, in a detailed report on Trump. One doesn't have to use words like blackmail or alleged sexual impropriety, which quite a lot of people do, to be concerned about this long financial relationship that Trump had with Russia. And he came closer. He was normally being expected to, having received money from Russia, making known and scheduled repayments. There's no evidence of this, but there's a lot of evidence of the financial link. Now, I've always rejected such words as unhinged, crazy, or mad to describe Trump. In my mind, he was never that. Indeed, the psychiatrist Professor Alan Francis writes, and I quote here, Trump's boorish manners, vulgar speech, and abusive actions make him a national embarrassment and the worst of all possible role models. He diminishes America. And then he went on to say, but none of this makes him mentally ill. Now, old rules of diplomacy are being cast aside, replaced by bullying, hectoring tactics laced with falsehoods by both Trump and Putin. Both use false propaganda and falsehoods by both Trump and Putin and are recognizable, but still they do it. Both use false propaganda. Both have expansionist plans. Putin's expansion is to return to the old Soviet Union boundaries, and Trump to claim Greenland, we now have him, the Panama Canal, changes to the Gulf of Mexico, which has to be renamed, the Gulf of America, and not least has designs on Canada becoming the 51st state. I mean, just to repeat these demands is almost a joke, but it's not a joke for this man. If you listen to him, he wants these things. Given half a chance, he'll take these things. Now, Trump and Putin both employ fear and threats as a tactic. That's, of course, the tactic of the mob boss. Tactics as described by Gideon Rachman in the Financial Times. And there are no doubt some similarity with mob bossings. Trump can be unpredictable. He certainly can be irritable and irrational. Roughing up the president of Ukraine in front of TV crews in the midst of his country's courageous fight against Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an example. And I don't know whether any of you have watched that interview, which was all on television, and you saw in the conduct of Trump and the questions he asked, and that of his vice president, particularly tough and aggressive. Now look at Putin. One of the first, I think, characteristics is he shows absolute self-control and a ruthless, calculating mind, not the hallmarks of hubris. Both Putin and Trump are revengeful. They show contempt for others and do not like to be challenged. Some psychologists use the term sadist or psychopath when describing Putin. I don't recognize those terms. Others reflect that he fits the personality of a hostile enforcer, a non-pathological type characterized by compulsive and sadistic traits. Again, I'm not at all sure that hits the button in trying to analyze Putin. The panel's discussions that are following what I've been saying, I'm sure some of you better qualified than I, analyze such traits. The problem in question is, how does the world react to these two leaders who deploy tear-up policies? It's hard to see where the internal checks and balances will come in respect of the autocratic rule of Putin. But even in the US, it appears, the checks and balances in the US Constitution are insufficient to curb the worst of Trump's increasing rule by executive order. Many people, and I'm one of them, have in the past admired the American Constitution, seen merits in its operation and in its conduct. Max Hastings, the military historian, wrote in the Times last month, Trump confronts America's super rich with the same proposition that Putin offers Russian oligarchs. Make as much money as you like, but if you mess with my policies, I'll break you. I think that's quite a perceptive analysis. And Max Hastings goes on to say, fear and hatred are the tire levers in Trump's toolkit. And the same could be said of Putin. Henry Kissinger perceptively analyzed the first Trump presidency, and remember he's had two goes at this, by saying, I think Trump may be one of those figures in history who appears from time to time to mark the end of an era and to force it to give up its old pretenses. It does not necessarily mean, Kissinger went on to say, that Trump knows this or that Trump is considering any great alternative. It could just be an accident. The end of an era could well involve Trump abandoning the US role within NATO, practiced by all US presidents since 1949, that under Article 5, the US military would respond in Europe and from America to any aggressive military action on any NATO member state. Very far-reaching, but very comforting. Now, I think we should stop being comforted by it. Trump has every right to rethink the US role, but it has to be done at the right time. Let us hope those Americans who literally were great people, who came into Europe rescuing us from the challenge and abuses of Hitler. And there were even then in America, many people did not want America to come over and fight other people's wars. There was a strong political movement. Fortunately, there was a strong president, one of the great American presidents, Franklin Roosevelt, and they came. And when at D-Day, the battle was launched, there were the American GIs alongside our own soldiers and other European countries who were occupied, but whose soldiers had got away and had come and often to the British and rearmed and were ready to fight. But let us be under no illusion. That war would never have come to an end as quickly and as completely as it did had it not been for the United States coming over and helping us. I urge all those interested in politics to never forget the causal link between holding power and aberrant behavior. And that link is proven now. Power is a heady drug, which not every leader has the necessary rooted character to counteract. To do so requires a combination of common sense, humor, decency, skepticism, and even cynicism that treats power for what it is, a privileged opportunity to influence and sometimes to determine with skill and patience the turn of events. And it's dangerous. Hubris for those who wield power and are quite unaware of the fact that their own personality has changed with their accretion of power. They don't understand it, they don't recognize it, they don't like it being pointed out to them. But we all have, in my view, a duty, and the medical profession is but one, leaders everywhere, to understand how hubris can gather momentum inside the personality of a perfectly normal individual, and that it has to be curbed and eradicated if that individual is to be successful, and above all, if that individual is not to do huge amount of harm when they are, if they are, in power. Thank you for listening to me. I wish I had been with you. I apologize for not coming, but my health is not very good at the moment, and I'm afraid it's not easy for me to travel. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. I would now like to invite the next speaker onto the platform, Eugene Sattler-Smith. He is Professor of Organizational Behavior at Surrey Business School, University of Surrey in the United Kingdom. He has a first degree from the University of Leeds and a PhD from the University of Birmingham. His research interests are intuition in decision-making and hubris in leadership. He has published extensively on both topics, and his recent books include Intuition in Business, Trust Your Gut, Hubristic Leadership, and the Hubris Hazard, and how to avoid it. Eugene Sattler-Smith.
Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here in Vilnius and a great honor to speak at this important conference. My sincere thanks to Robert for the kind invitation and for Greta for organizing things. The title of my talk is The Hubris Hazard and Stepping Back from the Abyss. It's about how the human factor in leadership, and especially the phenomenon of hubris, can drive leaders, organizations, and even whole nations to the edge of disaster. And even more crucially, it's about what we might do to step back from that brink. But let me begin with a quote from Sakharov himself, who said, "Every rational creature finding itself on the brink of a disaster first tries to get away from the brink." But the question we must ask is this: why do we keep finding ourselves at the brink, and why, time and time again, do we fail to step back? My own research focuses on hubris through the lens of business management. However, there are valuable lessons to be learned and shared between the worlds of business and politics when it comes to understanding and addressing hubristic leadership. Hubris, this dangerous blend of pride, arrogance, and overconfidence, has time and again propelled leaders, business executives, and entire nation states towards catastrophe. In both the public and private spheres, hubris has proven to be not just a personal flaw of a leader, but a systemic hazard. In politics, business causes crises, inflames divisions, and escalates conflicts. In business management, its consequences are equally destructive. Think of the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers in the 2008 financial crisis. More recently, think of the demise of the blood testing company Theranos and the cryptocurrency firm FTX, and recall the jailing of their founders, Elizabeth Holmes and Sam Bankman-Fried, for 11 and 25 years, respectively. These were organizations brought down by leaders intoxicated by their own arrogance and self-belief, who ignored warning signs and silenced critics, and who thought that the normal rules didn't apply to them. Clearly, hubris costs. But hubris doesn't stop at bankruptcy and jail terms. It topples governments and it starts wars. Bertrand Russell, in his A History of Western Philosophy, described hubris as an intoxication of power, a certain kind of madness, and the greatest danger of our time. The fact that these words were published in 1946 at the end of one of the worst conflicts in human history begs the question, as we stand on the edge of yet another abyss, of whether any lessons have been or can be learned from past mistakes. But as General Dallaire reminded us yesterday, it's important that the lessons we learn from history are the right lessons. Although I'm not a military expert, I'd like to say a few words about hubris and armed conflict. The annals of war are filled with examples of the arrogance and overreach of military leaders leading to disaster. We need only think of Xerxes crossing the Hellespont in 480 BC, Napoleon's doomed march on Moscow in 1812, and Hitler's 1941 invasion of Russia. Sir Alistair Horn, the eminent military historian, called the 20th century the century of hubris. It was a century in which, in his words, humans were slaughtered in numbers to exceed those of any other century, all at the whim of one or two warlords or dictators. He also noted how very little these great warlords ever learned from the calamities of their predecessors, which led him to ask, why don't successful generals know when to stop? More recently, as our previous speaker, Lord Owen, has written about extensively, the 2003 invasion of Iraq stands as a powerful example of hubris in the 21st century. Fueled by overconfidence in military might and ideological certainty, Western leaders dismissed expert warnings, relied on flawed intelligence, and underestimated the complexity of the situation they were getting themselves into. They assumed a warm embrace of democracy and a swift victory in Iraq. Instead, their refusal to listen to voices calling for intelligent restraint led to years of chaos, insurgency, and instability. The cost? Many thousands of military personnel on both sides and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians lost their lives. Millions more were displaced. The conflict cost trillions of dollars, strained military resources, left Iraq's infrastructure in ruins. It also irreparably damaged the reputations of those who took the decision to invade in the first place. Far from bringing stability, the war fueled sectarian violence and helped give rise to ISIS. It stands as a stark and recent reminder of the human, financial, and geopolitical costs of military overreach driven by hubris. To understand hubris more deeply, we return, as we so often must, to the ancient Greeks. The term hubris comes from the Greek hybris, meaning reckless pride, arrogance, and insolence, and the Greeks had many warnings about it. Perhaps the most famous is the story of Icarus and Daedalus. When Daedalus made wings of wax and feathers to escape imprisonment on the island of Crete, he warned his son Icarus not to fly too close to the sun. But Icarus was seduced by the power of flight and soared too high. The sun melted the wax and he fell to the sea and drowned. He was punished for his hubris by the goddess Nemesis, the bringer of retribution. This message is echoed in the Bible's book of Proverbs. Pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. As the philosopher Mary Midgley insightfully observed, hubris has a way of inviting its own nemesis. When leaders act out of arrogance, they often plant the seeds of their own undoing. The consequences that follow are not merely unfortunate accidents. They are signs of a deeper intellectual and moral failing in the original overconfident act. Hubris just doesn't increase the risk of failure. It actively creates conditions that make failure more likely. So when things go wrong, it isn't just bad luck. It's the reckoning that arrogance inevitably invites. To put it plainly, drawing on Midgley's view and my own, there may not be a simple straight line from hubris to nemesis, but the connection is strong enough to be taken seriously. Hubristic actions tend to increase the likelihood of destructive outcomes. That's why hubristic leaders and the followers who enable them must be prepared to face the consequences and held accountable for what unfolds. Each gets what they asked for. Consider the reckless gamble of imposing punitive tariffs on your largest trading partner in defiance of economic reason. And yet this is precisely what unfolded recently in the United States. The results? Markets recoiled, equity values plunged, bond yields surged. Experts have observed that if one were deliberately trying to sabotage an economy, one could hardly choose a better method. What begins as posturing and bravado can all too easily descend into economic chaos. In the theatre of power, hubris isn't just a leadership failing, it's a blueprint for disaster that turns farce into tragedy. If we are to understand the characteristics and causes of hubris and combat its destructive consequences, we need to name it. So how do we define this sometimes slippery but invariably dangerous phenomenon? I define it as a grandiose sense of self characterized by overconfidence, arrogance, pride, and contempt towards the advice and criticism of others. Hubristic leaders become deluded by their own self-worth and capabilities. They overestimate the likelihood of positive outcomes and underestimate the likelihood of negative outcomes. And without proper checks and balances, they create conditions which invite unintended negative consequences. All too often, error becomes inevitable and disaster unavoidable. But their negative influence then radiates outwards. It affects teams, organizations, and entire societies, and its effects reverberate long after the leader has departed from office. This makes hubris not just a personal failing, but a societal risk. The previous speaker, Lord Owen, has written extensively about the behaviors associated with hubris. He coined the term hubris syndrome, a syndrome being a group of symptoms that signal a dysfunction, and I will quickly recap. Lord Owen identified 14 symptoms of hubris syndrome. Some are unique to it, for example, restlessness, recklessness, and impulsiveness. Others overlap with conditions like narcissistic personality disorder, for example, disproportionate concern with image and presentation. The syndrome is triggered by power and can be considered an intoxication of power. And as such, it's distinct from narcissism, which is an intoxication with the self. Even though hubris and narcissism are closely related, it's possible for a leader to be hubristic but not narcissistic. Equally, it's possible for a leader to be both hubristic and narcissistic. I leave you to think of your own example of the latter. As Lord Owen has observed, UK Prime Ministers David Lloyd George, Margaret Thatcher, and Tony Blair, as well as US President George W. Bush, all exhibited signs of hubris syndrome. And as the 19th century British historian Lord Acton famously warned, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Acton's truth makes hubris not just a personal flaw of a leader, but a serious occupational hazard for those in positions of leadership in business and in politics. In my own research, I've identified at least 6 drivers of hubris. Power and success are a precondition. Narcissism manifests as intoxication with self. Testosterone manifests as irrational exuberance. Cognitive complexity manifests in simple language. And hypercore self-evaluation, of which I'll say more in a moment, and self-deception, which I've called elsewhere meta-ignorance, ignorance of one's own ignorance. There isn't time to go into each in detail, but at the root of many of them is excess, and excess leads to overreach. Take core self-evaluation, for example, which includes self-esteem, self-worth, and locus of control. At healthy levels, the qualities that core self-evaluation bring are essential for leadership and are the very things which selection panels and voters should look for in leadership candidates. But in excess, that is when healthy core self-evaluation turns into hyper core self-evaluation. Leaders begin to believe they are infallible and omnipotent. This is the strengths into weaknesses paradox of hubristic leadership. What once made a leader effective now drives reckless decision-making. An essential leadership strength, such as confidence, becomes arrogance. Ambition becomes grandiosity. Capability becomes self-deception. Vision becomes delusion. And all too often, disaster follows. Again, going back to the ancient Greeks, moderation or temperance encompassed the ideal of avoiding extremes, hence their saying, nothing in excess. The opposite was hybris. And Aristotle's concept of the golden mean emphasized that virtues lie between the two extremes of excess and efficiency. Thinking on the bright side for one moment, perhaps there is some overarching virtue or saving grace that could protect leaders and organizations and institutions from the dangers of hubris. We can only get so far in understanding the causes of hubris and how to combat it by looking at the leader themselves. We need to look beyond the leader because hubris does not arise in a vacuum. Certain personal traits like an inflated sense of self-worth and the ability to deceive oneself can set the stage for hubris. These individual drivers increase the risk, but on their own, they aren't enough to produce hubristic leadership. It takes more than just personality. The leader's followers and the context also play an important role. This is the so-called toxic triangle of hubristic leadership, where the perfect storm of a hubristic leader in a conducive context with the backing of complicit followers makes destructive outcomes much more likely. Let's look briefly at the complicit follower and conducive context elements of the toxic triangle. Without followers, there can be no leadership, but people follow leaders for a variety of reasons. And there are different types of complicit followers in hubristic leadership. First, there are the conformers who are attracted to charismatic hubristic leaders because they hope and believe that such leaders will provide them with clarity, direction, purpose, self-esteem, and a sense of belonging. Then there are the acolytes, who, unlike the conformers, have a firm sense of self and are drawn to and become loyal to leaders because they see beliefs and values in the leader which fit with their own. And then there are the opportunists, who might not even share the leader's beliefs and values, but are loyal and complicit because they see allying with the leader as a way to gain professionally, politically, or financially in a purely transactional relationship. In each case, these followers don't just enable hubristic leadership, they sustain and amplify it. Context also matters deeply, and three aspects of context may be helpful in understanding how hubristic leaders gain and retain power. The Venezuelan journalist Moises Naim, in his book The Revenge of Power, argued that today's autocrats use an eerily similar playbook, which he summed up in 3 words: populism, polarization, and post-truth. The 3P autocrat Naim describes in his book will be all too familiar to many of us. I'll use Naim's 3P framework to try and understand the context in which hubristic leaders gain, wield, and keep power. Firstly, populism. Hubristic autocrats claim to speak for the people and at the same time attack elites such as academics and institutions such as universities. In the hubristic autocrat's mind, speaking for the people gives them a self-declared common touch and a moral high ground. It also reinforces their perceived invincibility. They dismiss criticism as attacks from an establishment that they label as liberal, wasteful, and corrupt. They believe that they and they alone can make amends for the people's grievances. And the situation is made worse by the fact that hubristic autocrats often have the gift of being able to connect instinctively and intuitively with the needs and desires of their base of followership. Secondly, polarization. Hubristic autocrats thrive in polarized contexts by spreading the idea, typically in a simplified them versus us narrative, that the enemies of the people are everywhere. In the hubristic autocrat's polarized world, dissent from the leader's view is framed as betrayal, space for constructive opposition is confined, press freedom is inhibited, and the judiciary is undermined. Polarization causes splits, which leads opponents either to becoming prompted into overreaction, which amplifies divisions and plays into the hands of the hubristic autocrat, or they're paralyzed into inaction. Either way, checks and balances are weakened and the hubristic autocrat acts without constraint. Thirdly, post-truth. In a post-truth context, facts are relative and false narratives can be effortlessly created and spread. This makes it easy for hubristic autocrats to reframe their failures as victories, their shortcomings as strengths, and discredit opposing views with endless fabrications. They can be held to account, they can't be held to account because there aren't any objective measures of success. They demand loyalty to their autocratic kingdom. They reward acolytes and opportunists for affirming the leader's view, and anyone who speaks truth to power is sidelined or ousted. I'd now like to share some thoughts and think aloud about ways in which the hubris hazard can be combated. There's a well-known principle in risk management. Risk equals hazard times exposure. For example, in Australia, sharks can be a hazard to bathers, and the best way to reduce the risk to zero is to avoid exposure by staying out of the water. Hubristic leadership is a hazard, and we reduce the risk by minimizing our exposure to hubristic leaders. That means not appointing or electing a hubristic leader in the first place. As Benjamin Franklin said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Of course, this is much easier said than done, but nonetheless, voters need to be cautious about who they select as their leaders. Otherwise, they must shoulder their share of the responsibility if things turn out badly. As Thomas Jefferson is reputed to have said, the government you elect is the government you deserve. It's also possible to take action even after hubris has raised its head. The checks and balances we've seen recently in British politics, with the removal from office of 2 hubristic prime ministers, no less, by their own political party, prove that it is possible to force hubristic leaders from power. Another idea I'd like to think aloud about for managing the hubris hazard is the idea of a hubris health check, especially for senior business leaders such as CEOs. Let me offer an analogy. In the UK, it's illegal to drive a car without a valid safety inspection on the vehicle. If the car's braking system, wheels, etc., do not meet the required standard, it can't be driven legally on the road. Why shouldn't we have something similar for CEOs? Early warning signs that any leader is likely to become derailed by hubris will include: does the leader show signs of intoxication with power by failing other people's views into account and showing a complete lack of empathy? Does the leader show signs of irrational exuberance by engaging in reckless and risk-seeking behaviors? Does the leader show signs of self-deception by being unaware of how unskilled and incompetent they really are? Does the leader exhibit narcissistic tendencies in a need for constant adulation and affirmation? And does the leader surround themselves with an echo chamber of their own making in order to suppress criticism and quash dissent? In my work, I've met CEOs who are amenable to the idea of a hubris health check, but of course, these are the kinds of leaders who need it least. And as David Owen has mentioned, hubris don't like having their hubris pointed out to them. More importantly, a hubris health check could give those with the power to constrain a hubristic leader, such as chairs and non-executive directors of businesses, a checklist of early warning signs to be on the lookout for. Moreover, the leader does not have to agree to it for the warning signs to be observed. Okay, yeah, thanks. I'll slow down a bit. Moreover, the leader does not have to agree to it for the warning signs to be observed informally, and the media may also have a role to play in sounding the alarm. It's not a perfect solution, but an early warning system for hubris could be a step in the right direction, and perhaps it could also be used beyond business. But is there some quality that we should look out for in a leader before they get elected or appointed that could be used by appointment panels or voters as a marker by which to include candidates who have it and exclude those who don't? I believe that such a quality does exist, and it could provide immunity against the occupational hazard of hubris. This quality is to be found in a speech entitled Reflections on Leadership in a Disruptive Age, made in 2018 by someone who at the time was the head of a central bank in a G7 nation. In this speech, the leader identified 4 essential attributes of hubris, of leadership, Freudian slip, ambition, purpose, clarity, and humility. The speaker singled out humility for special attention, commenting that good leaders combine personal humility and self-knowledge with the ability to learn. When leaders become overconfident, that's when they stop learning, and that can be the beginning of the slippery slope to hubris. Our mystery speaker also said that leaders need to be humble about success and honest about failure, and emphasized the point that humility and honesty are essential to authentic leadership and, by definition, are hard to fake. But who is this person? At the time of the speech I've been referring to, he was the governor of the Bank of England, and before that, the governor of the Bank of Canada. It is, of course, Mark Carney. Thank you. It is, of course, Mark Carney, who I need not remind you is now the Prime Minister of Canada. Pause for applause. Thank you. In his recent victory speech, Carney reiterated his earlier remarks about humility when he said, "I will begin with the value of humility and will admit that I have much to be humble about. Over my long career, I have made many mistakes, and I will make more, but I commit to admitting to them openly, to correcting them quickly, and always learning from them." It is interesting to note that Carney's election has, in part, been attributed as a reaction to Trump's hubris, which gives us an interesting juxtaposition in a yin-yang relationship between hubris and humility. But a word about humility. A humble person isn't fragile, weak, and self-deprecating. Humble leaders are competent, confident, and self-assured, but they also know their limits. Eisenhower's biographer said of him that he had the kind of confidence that allowed him to be humble. Humble leaders do not think less of themselves. They know what they're capable of, but they do think of themselves less. They think of others before they think of themselves. Humility is not a weakness. It's not shyness or self-effacement. It is a strength grounded in service to others, not service to the ego. Perhaps being humble as a leader is something that we need to shout more loudly about. To summarize, I've spoken to you about a danger that all too often goes unnoticed until it's too late, the danger of hubris in leadership. The hubris hazard has led individuals, organizations, and entire nations to the edge of disaster, and sometimes well beyond. Hubris is an occupational hazard for any leader, but it doesn't arise in isolation. It thrives in a perfect storm, a toxic triangle created by a hubristic leader, a conducive context, and complicit followers. The complicit followers come in familiar types: the conformers who remain silent, the acolytes who flatter, the opportunists who encourage recklessness when it serves their interests. The conducive context is shaped by populism, polarization, and a post-truth culture that rewards spectacle over substance. Together, these elements form a fertile breeding ground for leaders who stop listening, stop learning, and start believing they are omnipotent and infallible. Make no mistake, hubristic leadership is not just an occupational hazard for those in power, it's a societal hazard. From corporate collapses to political catastrophes and the tragic toll of war, we have seen time and again the destruction that follows. So how can this risk be managed, and what is the antidote? I've proposed a prevention principle and a hubris health check, a serious test of fitness for leadership roles, especially for CEOs and public officials. But more than that, perhaps we need to restore humility as the essential leadership virtue of our time. To conclude, humility could be the saving grace that inoculates leaders against the hubris hazard in 3 ways. First, it protects leaders and their organizations and institutions by making leaders receptive to feedback and advice, whereas hubris shuts down criticism and leads to catastrophic blind spots. Second, humble leaders know they're fallible and imperfect. This makes them cautious and collaborative, whereas hubristic leaders assume they're infallible and omnipotent, which breeds arrogance and recklessness. Finally, humble leaders prioritize their followers and the greater good, whereas hubristic leaders prioritize nothing but their own self-interest, their egotistical pride, and their legacy. If hubris is something deeply rooted in human nature, then how can we guard against something that's a fundamental part of our human condition? The ancient Greeks may offer us more wisdom here. They believe that true virtue lies in the middle way between excess and deficiency. But there's no simple formula for finding that balance. Each moment, each decision must be judged in its own context. Hubris by its nature is an excess, a step too far. And the best way to resist it is to learn to recognize it, to be alert to its signs, and to hold our leaders in check before it takes hold. I will end by taking the liberty of paraphrasing the words of that great speaker of truth to power, Andrei Sakharov, with which I opened this talk. Humble leaders avoid being drawn to the edge of the abyss. Hubristic leaders think they know best and press forward into the abyss in the firm belief that they cannot fail. Ultimately, the choice is ours. We can step back from the abyss, but only if we are willing to name the hazard, reduce the exposure, and choose wisely those who we allow to lead us. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Eugene. That was absolutely brilliant. Third speaker, keynote speaker of this morning is Simon Baron-Cohen. Unfortunately, again, on screen, but I'm very happy that we have him. He's a professor in the Department of Psychology and Psychiatry at the University of Cambridge and a fellow at Trinity College in Cambridge. He's director of the Autism Research Center in Cambridge, which is set up in 1997. And he's the author of 3 popular science books that have educated the public about autism and related areas of psychology. The Essential Difference, The Science of Evil, The Origins of Cruelty, also published as 0 Degrees of Empathy, and The Pattern Seekers. Simon Baron-Cohen.
So thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this important conference on conflict resolution. And I'm sorry I'm not there in person in Vilnius. I'm speaking to you from Cambridge University. And you can see the title of my presentation is about the role of empathy in conflict resolution. I'm a psychologist, and I've been looking at empathy from a variety of angles. And I wrote a book published in 2011 called 0 Degrees of Empathy. And it was really a theory to try to understand both human cruelty. How do we explain acts of cruelty between humans, but also on the flip side, kindness. So in my book, I argue that empathy is it's a concept that has at least 2 components. So we think of empathy as, the ability to put yourself into someone else's shoes, to imagine what someone else is thinking or feeling, but also to respond appropriately. But these 2 components, the cognitive part of empathy is the recognition part, so imagining someone's thoughts and feelings. The affective part is the response part, that once you've identified what someone is thinking or feeling, do you have an appropriate emotional response to their experience? And what I'm going to argue is that when we lose our affective empathy, we become capable of extremes of cruelty, which is obviously relevant to human conflict. So I don't need to remind you that human beings are capable of cruelty, but I'll just have a few examples from the Holocaust, where these 2 German doctors were conducting medical experiments into prisoners in the Dachau concentration camp. They were interested in how long a human being can survive in freezing water. And like good scientists, they took systematic measures, including duration until death. And what strikes us as a viewer in 2025 is, how was it possible for humans to lose sight of the subjectivity of their participant in the experiment, the thoughts and feelings and human rights? These were educated doctors, obviously, but somehow they had dehumanized the person in the experiment. We can think of other examples from the Holocaust, and everyone has heard of another doctor, Joseph Mengele, this time in a different concentration camp in Poland, in Auschwitz, who had a particular scientific interest in twins. And these 2 twins, Eva and Miriam Moses, were subjected to his experiments where he was trying to operate on twins, often without anesthetic. I think they were 10 years old at the time, to try and understand questions to do with genetics and environmental influences. Again, how is it possible that somebody could be so cruel to clearly innocent children? Somewhat uncomfortably, this is a photo from a documentary that came out just a few weeks ago on the BBC by Simon Sharma. It's called The Road to Auschwitz, and I recommend it. He's a historian, as many of you know, a historian of the history of the Jews. And what you can see in this photograph, in Kovno, also called Kaunas, in Lithuania, not so far away from Vilnius, on June the 27th, 1941, about 50 Jews in this town were pulled out of their homes and their workplaces and brutally murdered by Lithuanians, sadly, because the Nazis far away in Germany had instructed that it was okay to kill minorities in the population, including Jews. What strikes me in this photo is the bystanders just watching after this atrocity has taken place. And again, we have to ask ourselves about the role of empathy in such conflicts. Let's kind of fast forward to more recent times, because we know that a conflict that continues is between Israel and Palestine, and October the 7th, 2023 is a date that's in all of our minds when Hamas terrorists attacked civilians, innocent civilians, on Kibbutz Be'eri in Israel. Their brutal attacks reveal that in the act of the attack, they must have had no empathy for their victims. Imagine if they had been using empathy, would they have been capable of doing the horrific things they did, which included rape and murder? By the same token, we know that the Israeli reaction to that attack has led to thousands of people in Gaza losing their homes, losing their lives, being injured. Many of them, as you can see in these photographs, old people and children. And we have to ask ourselves, even in the context of war, how is it possible for human beings to lose their empathy for fellow human beings? So back in 2019, I wrote an article in the Guardian newspaper and argued that in the context of the Israel-Palestine conflict, which has been going on since at least 1948 with the creation of the State of Israel, but longer than that, whilst it was the British Mandate of Palestine, we've seen a series of wars, at least 12 or 13, which seem to be on repeat, that an attack from one side provokes a reaction, a military reaction from the other side, and it doesn't lead to peace. So military approaches to that very long-standing conflict arguably have failed so far. And I argued in that article that if we do what we can to nurture empathy in both communities, to think about the thoughts and feelings and rights of people from the other community, that could be a valuable route to conflict resolution. In my book that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, I introduced the idea that all of us in the population are situated somewhere on what I call the empathy bell curve. You can measure empathy in the population, and empathy differs, as you can see. Most of us are just average, so in the middle of that bell curve. Some people are above average, so they have high empathy, and I'm going to argue later that if you nurture empathy to increase the level of empathy, that can lead to greater acts of human kindness. But some people are below average on empathy. I'm wanting to draw your attention to the low end of this distribution. And I explored in my book, what are the social and biological factors that lead somebody to lose their empathy, what I call empathy erosion, such that they become capable of acts of cruelty. So some of the factors that have been discussed in the literature include obedience to authority or conformity, it was widely discussed after the Holocaust, for example, that many people who participated in the Nazi Party said they were just following orders. And the work of Stanley Milgram at Yale University sort of demonstrates that if you ask volunteers to administer electric shocks to somebody, even without knowing that these are actually not real, to help them learn, ordinary people will follow orders, particularly if they're given by, for example, an authority figure like a scientist in a white coat, to deliver really very high levels of electric shock. So conformity and obedience to authority may be one factor. The second factor that could lead to the erosion of empathy is ideology. When we think about 9/11 and the terrorists who flew the planes into the Twin Tower, we have to assume that they were in the grip of ideological beliefs that they were doing the right thing. So ideology may be another factor that could erode your empathy for the people on the receiving end of your actions. And a third factor that is widely discussed in social psychology is in-group, out-group relations. So if we think back to the Rwanda genocide in 1994, where 500,000 Tutsis died at the hands of the Hutu militias, a lot of that was generated by propaganda where the other community, the Tutsis, were described as subhuman, quite similar to the propaganda used by the Nazis towards many groups in the population, not just Jews, but also Roma and people who had disabilities. And when you dehumanize another group, the out group, not just to portray them as inferior, but also subhuman, it can legitimize all kinds of cruel behavior towards that group. John Bowlby was a pediatrician working at the Tavistock Clinic in London. And he studied medicine here in my college at Trinity College, where I'm speaking to you from in Cambridge. And in the 1950s, he came up with a very important theory about empathy, which is around the concept of attachment, that children need a secure attachment in their upbringing, in their early development, an attachment between themselves and a loving parent or caregiver. And if that bond, if that attachment is insecure or weak, individuals can grow up not caring about the feelings of others. And he studied delinquents, children and teenagers who were committing antisocial behavior and criminal acts, and found that many of them had experienced neglect or abuse in their early childhood, or multiple caregivers, so that they weren't forming deep attachments with a parent figure or a grandparent figure. And obviously, if you grow up not feeling a deep sense of being loved, it may be difficult to feel kindness or generosity or empathy for others. And Avshalom Caspi at the Institute of Psychiatry at King's College in London found childhood maltreatment was not only one factor that could lead to increased likelihood of antisocial behavior or cruelty, but this interacts with genetic factors. So here we can see that depending on which version of a gene you carry, it's called the MAOA gene. If you've experienced greater maltreatment, increased maltreatment such as abuse and neglect, that increases your likelihood of antisocial behavior. But if you're a carrier of the red version of this gene, that increases your likelihood even more. So genes and environment can interact. And in my book, I outline that today, with modern neuroscience, we can study the brain basis of empathy. Empathy isn't the result of a single brain region, a single part of the brain, but rather it's the result of the activity of a circuit in the brain that connects many different brain regions. I've shown on this slide that there are at least 10 different regions, some of them in the frontal lobes, such as the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, others deep in the subcortex of the brain, such as the amygdala, and that different brain regions play differing roles in both cognitive and affective empathy. And when the activity in these brain regions goes down, caused by either those social factors we heard about, or maybe biological factors in interaction with social and psychological factors, we become capable of losing our empathy. So far, I've spoken about the erosion of empathy, but I want to bring you back to the bell curve and think about people at the other end of the distribution, people with above average or even high empathy, and its role in conflict resolution. Imagine that you're working in this non-governmental organization, it's called Proactiva, where your job, your work, is to rescue refugees who are potentially, running for their lives and may die on small boats. This was an image taken just off the coast of Libya in the Mediterranean in 2016. But here we see individuals whose empathy must be at a high level because they are working day and night to help others, even though they're from a different social group, a different community. And let's think back to the Holocaust about individuals like Raoul Wallenberg, who was the Swedish ambassador in Hungary, based in Budapest, when he saw hundreds of thousands of Jews being put on the trains to the concentration camps, where they would face inevitable murder. Many of you know the story of Raoul Wallenberg, which is that he produced fake Swedish passports, and he went down to the platform of the station in Budapest and pushed the fake passports through the windows of the carriages on the train, and then said to the Nazis that on this train there are Swedish citizens who should be released. And they were able to, the Jews were able to show these fake Swedish papers, and over time, Wallenberg is estimated to have saved the lives of 100,000 Jews who would otherwise have died. He did this at huge personal risk, but presumably his behavior was motivated by high levels of empathy for what would have happened if he didn't take that action. I want to tell you about another non-governmental organization called the Parents Circle, which operates in Israel and Palestine. It brings together parents, as the name suggests, who have lost a relative in that long-running conflict. Siham is a Palestinian woman, and her brother was killed by an Israeli bullet. Robbie is an Israeli woman, and her son was killed by a Palestinian bullet. They could have succumbed to the very natural emotion of wanting revenge and feeling hate for the other community. But instead, through this charity, the Parent Circle, which connects people from both sides of the political divide, they phoned each other and spoke to each other, one human being to another, to acknowledge that the other person was going through the same emotional state as they were. They were suffering the same grief, the same loss, and the same fear of what was happening in their community. And they formed a friendship, and actually they came to Cambridge, where I was able to meet them, and I was inspired by their work. But one thing they said when they gave their presentation was that the conflict won't stop until we have empathy for one another. Finally, thinking about another conflict, the end of apartheid in South Africa between the white and the black community. Arguably, apartheid came to an end because these two men, de Klerk and Mandela, formed a relationship of listening, of appreciating the perspective of the other person, of thinking about the other community, not just their own community. And amongst other factors, I would argue that empathy played a role in the end of that conflict. So in 2016, I co-organized a conference at the British Academy in London. You can see the title of it here, Empathy, Neuroscience, Translational Relevance for Conflict Resolution, where we brought together both Palestinians and Israelis working at grassroots level to talk about the role of empathy. And they were able to interact with scientists who study empathy to really bring out a very important point, which is that empathy is a natural resource that all human beings possess that doesn't cost anything, but that if we nurture it, it's our most valuable natural resource for conflict resolution, far cheaper than military approaches or legal approaches, or economic boycotts, or other kinds of approaches that have been tried and often failed in some of the conflicts we've talked about. And I was invited in 2017 to a seminar held at the United Nations called The Question of Palestine. And I was honored to be on the same platform as Palestinians, discussing different options for this long-standing conflict, and in particular raising this quite new approach that we need to explore the potential of empathy in conflict resolution. Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll go now for a coffee break, and we'll be back here 10 minutes after 11. Thank you. Okay, can we all take a seat, please? Good. So let's start with the fourth and last panel of the conference. The human factor, are we our worst enemy? And it's moderated by Janet Anderson, one of the two Janets. And speaking are Romeo Dallaire, Abram de Swaan, and Simon Wesley, and Maka Berulava as a young challenger. Janet.
Great, thank you very much. Maybe a little unconventionally, I'd like to start with a joke. That's okay. Does everybody understand the knock-knock tradition? I say knock-knock, you say Who's
Who's there?
Okay, so knock knock.
Who's there?
Narcissistic cow. And you say? Narcissistic cow. Who? Me. Okay. Now, the reason why I did this
That went well.
yeah, exactly. I knew it would go that well. The reason why I did this was because I had in the back of my mind this whole kind of idea of trying to set up this panel of a general, a sociologist, and a psychiatrist walk into a bar. But then I didn't know what to do with it after that. So I thought, okay, that one's not going to go very well either. But the reason why I did that is just to say we have this incredible, wide-ranging, hugely experienced, amazing group of people to talk about this. And we have this extraordinary title. Again, Robert, your titles. Are we our worst enemy, which provoked Abraham to say to me, what are we meant to be doing? And so on. So, you know, we are all working, we are a work in progress. Do we agree?
Absolutely.
That we will try to attempt to tackle this problem, but we don't know where we're going to end up at the end of this panel. We don't know what the conclusion is. Yes, no, we don't know. So, let me just introduce the panel a little more formally. Romeo Dallaire, Lieutenant General, retired. I'm sorry if I speak it the English way. Former Canadian Senator, founder of the Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace and Security, and most notably served in a long and distinguished career as the Force Commander of the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda during the 1994 genocide. Abraham de Svan from the Netherlands, Emeritus Distinguished Research Professor of Social Science of the University of Amsterdam, and most notably a teacher to my husband at that university. This is how I know him. His most recent book is called Tegen de Vrouwen, which is due to be published late in 2025, later this year, under the English translation Against the Women, Resistance to Women's Liberation, which I think is going to be fascinating. Simon Wesley, the interim dean of the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience at King's College London, honorary consultant advisor in psychiatry to the British Army, working with several charities for veterans, and our young challenger, Maka Berulava from Georgia. Maka is a research analyst at the Andrei Sakharov Research Centre. She studied in both Kaunas, University College London, and she is currently pursuing a second master's in future media and journalism, also back again in Kaunas. Just another small note, in 2022-23, she served as the young ambassador of Georgia to Lithuania. So, I'm not going to try to set sort of the scene for any of you. I'm just going to ask all three of you to launch in. I've asked you each to speak for around 10 minutes, and we'll, with your permission, try to kind of catch your eye as needed in order to interrupt. But we do have a reasonable amount of time. So if you don't mind me indulging them, I would like to indulge them, because it's so rare to get to hear from such distinguished people in one panel together. So, General Dallaire, please kick us off.
Thank you, Janet. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm going to stay
If you think that the retired general, who's also a retired senator, is going to be brief, you're in the wrong room. However, I'm going to be using my argument of how did we create these entities that are creating such an extraordinary disconnect in the advancement of humanity. I'll be using some slides, of course. I only brought 146. My latest book, my fourth, is entitled The Peace, A Warrior's Journey. And in there I use Dante's Divine Comedy to describe how countries are either still in the inferno, others are in purgatory, trying to make their way through that, and the ultimate aim is how some are trying to get through that circle of fire to try to move the mountain towards ultimate aim, which is peace. And I argue that because even since Westphalia, which is a significant exercise in the advancement of humanity, of which we're putting at risk even now, what we have never achieved is peace. We have only achieved truces. The day after we ended World War II, we took it up with the Russians. And I can only continue to use multitudes of examples where we've had truces, and truces have had very short lives, and we have created essentially generational wars, because fundamentally we've never gone to the essence of the frictions of our differences, and because of that it continues to rebound and regenerate and created from new dimensions, be it technology, economics, religion, ethnicity, or even governance, and certainly hubris is part of it. So it is my belief that there is a possibility of moving us towards peace ultimately, but that to achieve that, we have hit a road and a bump that in fact is the start of a revolutionary era. We are in just the start of a revolutionary era. I say that without a uniform. If I had a uniform, they'd put me in jail. But in this era, it's not change. This is not a sort of phase. This is not reform. This is truly a revolutionary era for a number of factors. And I would argue that the essence of it, to come to a culminating point of becoming a revolution, started very much with the end of the Cold War. And so I want to just use a couple points. And one of the references I like using is from a book by Robert Keegan, and it's called Of Paradise and Power, America and Europe in the New World Order. Published, in fact, in 2004. And so there's a certain level of interest in regards to what the American situation was perceived at that time in 2004. Remembering we've had 9/11 and so on, and still there was this sort of expression that was coming out from Clinton and from Bush, in fact, at their administrations, that essentially it is their administration, for well or ill, designed, nevertheless, their design rested on the common and distinctly American assumption, that is, the United States is the indispensable nation. Americans seek to defend and advance a liberal international order. But the only stable and successful international order Americans can imagine is one that has the United States as its center. Nor can Americans conceive of an international order without American power. And so the basis of all our movements towards peace, or arguing towards peace, certainly emphasized by Kissinger and certainly in his 70s writings, was the fact that peace without power does not exist. And so my argument is that peace with power is not peace. It's a truce. Because peace with power essentially calls for the demand of people to exercise themselves against that for a variety of reasons and capabilities. Now, my background coming to this is from as a soldier. And as a soldier, I served in the Cambodian killing fields with the mission there. I had troops under my command in the killing fields. I had troops in Yugoslavia. I've commanded in the Rwandan genocide. And so that's the early 90s and the start of the New World Disorder, which I'll come to in a few moments. Sierra Leone and that child soldier war in 2001. In Darfur, I was the Prime Minister's emissary, and seeing what we could do to stop the killing and slaughtering of the African Sudanese by the Arab Sudanese in 2005, with a comprehensive peace agreement that did not include the youth, who are the rebel forces, nor the women at any way, shape, or form, who are being raped and used and abused massively in that exercise. I've been in South Sudan in 14 and in the Congo still now, and Burundi, Somalia with the child pirates and the like, with the work that I'm doing on that side of the house. And so what I wanted to do is sort of give you a feel of how did we create these leaders? How did these things actually come to being? There must be a rhythm, a scale, a premise that happened that brought them to power. And that, I think, is critical in the overall exercise, is what brings these people to power. And particularly in liberal democracies. How is it possible that they can use liberal democracies to actually come to power? And so, as my opening statement was, will humanity thrive into the future in this exercise of revolutionary times, or will we actually be trying to survive? And I'm hoping that we want to thrive. And so I argue that, in fact, using a great American philosopher who played baseball, is that the future is incredibly unpredictable. And worse than that is that the future is right now in our face. This is the period that we've come through, that we are used to. I'm a Cold Warrior. Most of my career was deployed in Germany with the Americans, Canadians, the Germans, the British for over 30 years. And so the Cold War was our method of looking at the world, and it was Eurocentric. The rest of the world was bought off by countries buying off dictators and so on, and kept them under control. And so it wasn't part of our exercise. So we had no real consciousness truly of what was going on in that era. And so we in this revolutionary time have things that are shifted on us to which we are still stumbling through to try to master. The security envelope that is out there and all the parameters of that and technology is keeping us continuously trying to catch up with what that security is going to be, the technology is going to do to that security, and how will we in fact establish an atmosphere of security. The environment, the years of leadership fighting environmental change. There's no more environmental change. It's a new environment, so get with it. And so how, with that massive global scenario, how is it possible that we kept arguing that this is not happening? And how come we have a friction between the populations, particularly the younger populations who see that future, and the leadership in wanting to accept such a grand global perspective of the future of humanity? Where is their thought towards that dimension? The information age is, in fact, a new and very immature instrument. And that has had a major impact on the leadership and how they can, of course, influence, because they can coalesce, they can be real time, and in fact, they can influence so many in the numbers that it has given them a force multiplier in the power that they have. And it also calls upon them to be responsive far more often. And so the information age, through all the different methods, is but still a very immature system that is trying to find its way, but it is being used and massively abused, in my opinion. We've entered a new era of types of wars and conflicts out there that we're still trying to grapple with, and which are the basis of some of the fundamental arguments of engagement or not, or prevention, that we're trying to work with. As well as the whole social media, as I have just indicated, has given us one significant factor in regards to information to us, that is to say, the 24-hour news networks. The electronic news is smothering us, and it is overriding the ability of leadership to ponder, to think, to analyze, to assess, to take risks, because it is in their face continuously, and so they are seeking to respond to it. And by the by, those who can master it are gaining more power, gaining more of a presence, and we can certainly see that with what's going on today. And so in this era of insecurity and in conflict, we were handed over, as we stumbled into the 90s, not knowing what to expect, a new world disorder. George Bush Sr. said we'd entered a new world order. Wrong. We entered a new world disorder. The massive movements of populations and the impact of poverty is creating rage that has pushed elements to extremes like terrorism and extremism, and even pandemics that are spreading much easier than in the past. We've gone to the extreme of ethnic cleansing and even genocide, where human beings are being questioned as being an actual resource worthy of us to spill blood to assist, to help, and I'll come back to that. And then we still got the most stupid weapon system in existence, which is nuclear weapons. That is the most wasteful, ineffective weapon system that exists in the earth today, and it undermines our whole credibility when we look at young people who say, why am I worried about spilling a bit of oil or a little plastic bag here when we've got enough power to eliminate the whole of humanity? And so when you're offering $600 billion modernization of the US American stocks that they're doing with more nuclear capability than during the Cold War at this time, and during the peace period that we had where we were supposed to be living with the peace dividend, the Americans increased their military power, the Russians increased, the Chinese increased, Europe decreased, and many other of us decreased. And so we were set up by and duped by the big powers of thinking that actually we were moving in a sort of an era of peace or potential peace. We're also in an era that, because of the nature of conflicts and what the factors are, is that the mandates and missions are not classic. It's not simply kinetic use of force anymore. There's a whole variety of factors of protection of civilians and the like, the presence of NGOs and how we work with them that requires far more lengthy engagements. And so going into Afghanistan for 10 years was a waste of rations. Going to Afghanistan for 40 years, maybe that might have been worth the while. But going and trying to change the nature of conflict to adjust to the bringing a new era for a nation, both culturally and economically and politically, is not something that's done by liberal governments easily when they're working on 4-year terms. And so imagine that 10 years was very long, but it is a peanut compared to the depth that is required. The ambiguity and complexity of what's going on is the norm. We don't have all the doctrines, the solutions to these complex, new, and ambiguous ethical, moral, and legal dilemmas that we face in the field as we try to not only halt and stop conflicts, but actually prevent them from happening. And only Kofi Annan created the only committee I sat on with Desmond Tutu on prevention of genocide, in which we were trying to bring the data of all the UN together in order to anticipate what might happen in countries down the road, to which all the UN agencies and departments refused to participate in exchanging information. And so without that massive collation of information, we were never able to actually get into the realm of preventing a genocide. In fact, we were still in a reactive mode. And so the rules of the game exist, but people are not playing by the rules. And so if they're not playing by the rules, what are they inventing? Who is inventing them, and what are the parameters that they're using? Well, we've gone to massive new arrangements in regards to the use in the extreme of even children as instruments of war and primary ones. We've seen hundreds of thousands of youths who have been displaced and abused by war. Those, ladies and gentlemen, are the guarantees of generational wars. We have generational wars. Gaza is but one phase of generational wars to continue, because those kids become adults and so on and so on. And we can have it in so many other countries, and we will see that continue because we're still trying to solve still these wars by kinetic, by ego, by power, versus the more subtle requirements of our era that it is needed. And so the old tools that we have in operations, what we call operations other than war, preventive deployments, peacekeeping, Chapter 6, the interventions in humanitarianism, they've fallen by the wayside. They've not achieved the mission. They've had some truces, but most of them have failed. And within 7 years, over the last 20 years, within the 7 years, most of the truces have failed and restarted because we've never gone to the essence of the difference between the people. And so, yeah, we're sitting between peace and war, and we've never achieved peace, and we certainly know what to do with war, except it's complicated now and much more demanding. But everything in between is often forgotten as, in fact, instruments that could prevent us from moving to the right-hand side of that scale. And in so doing, one of the fundamental premises, which I want to come to as the essence of the argument, is that human beings simply don't count anymore in the grander strategic exercises of power and their desire to advance nations into the future. Are all humans human, or are some more human than others? And in fact, in that saying, what I've discovered through the experiences is that human beings become things. That's the polite word. Human beings become insects. Not one country wanted to come and stop the war and the genocide in Rwanda. Not one, because it was called tribalism. But in fact, the only reason they didn't want to come is because there's nothing there except human beings. And there was too many of them anyways, as they said. So that did not move the powers of be to want to engage in actually advancing humanity and protecting these people. And in so doing, the will to intervene is just not there as we would hope and expect to see in a world that has moved to a whole new dimension. And in so doing, the factors that affect the political decisions, well, I would argue are of the following nature. I'm using the infernal portion of my book as some of the points. I would argue that deceit is within the realm constantly of the interactions in the world, that disinterest, that it's not in my yard and it's of not consequence to us. Self-interest is dominating all the political decisions that are taken care of and involving us. Ignorance of not knowing of what is going on truly and what the problem is and how to solve it and really prevent it. Revenge exists, of course, and is being exercised massively on great scales by the communications revolution and also by the influence they have through hate speech and the like. Fear is now returned into the game in a significant way. Violence and the structure of human beings, where human beings are not considered to be human or equal or of value as much as resources. Money, resources, greed is dominating the decision-making processes that I feel. And in fact, the support of that is denial that in fact we're really doing it for that, but in fact we are in a hypocritical way actually continuing to build our capabilities at the expense of others, and we're not prepared anymore to commit to humanity, but more to the local requirements. And so my argument in this era, it is with absolutely no surprise that we end up with narcissistic, hubris, egocentric, male-dominated decision-making in a world that has been created through all its institutions, from religion, through governance, through every body politic that we have, by men, dominated by men. And until The other half of humanity is part of the solution of a new era, a new philosophy of what leadership should be, a new philosophy of how we move humanity, because now we can actually talk about humanity and how we can bring it in communion with the planet. Unless we bring that half, the women half, as equals and their inputs into it, we will never, ever have peace. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank the General for only taking twice the amount of time that he was, not the full 146 slides, but a really interesting, compelling argument. Thank you so much, with lots of illustration. Let me now turn to my fellow contributors to this discussion. You can pick up any of the points that the General has made, but
we can't.
can and challenge him. But also, I'd just like to hear from you directly. What would you like to say, Professor de Zwaan?
What would I like to say? I would like to talk about the human factor. It means human actors, in the plural, connected in dynamic social structures. That was what we have been talking about. And I want to talk about, are we our own worst enemies? I'm going to give an example in which some of our enemies are very close to us, part of the same society, and even instances in which, yes, we or I may be standing in my own way. That is, I want to talk about one of the major threats of democratic societies, which are extreme right-wing parties, which are cropping up about everywhere, which are close to majorities or already have taken over governments in Europe and Latin America. Sometimes, like in Poland or Brazil, Democrats were capable of taking back control, but there is a groundswell of right-wing sentiment going on. That is immediately relevant for our subject because most right-wing parties are against support for Ukraine in its struggle with Putin, and they very much identify with the Russian regime for reasons to be discussed. So this right-wing vote is immediately relevant to our subject. And then the question is, what makes people vote for extreme right-wing parties, even though in my eyes and some of you, it might go against their direct interests? There is an avalanche of literature on the subject. Thousands of articles appear about this subject. Let me wrap up what I think is the key element, and I'm quoting the famous historian and sociologist Aretha Franklin. RSPECT, respect is all I want. RESPECT, respect is all I need. What I want to say with that is that it may be that many people who vote for right-wing parties feel somehow condescended to, belittled, humiliated. An author like Arlie Hochschild in Stolen Pride and in Another Land explains that very well in long interviews and observations with working class people, with rural people, who feel that somehow those city slicks, those academics, those highfalutin artists are taking them for a ride. And frankly, I think they're right. They're on the right, but they're right. There is a problem. First of all, how come this hasn't happened earlier? I think the taboo to vote for the extreme right, and even to vote for politicians who somehow sort of covertly, openly flirt with Nazism, gradually has disappeared. So after 80 years, this great taboo is on the way out. But still, the associations with National Socialism, with racism, with overt anti-Semitism are handled very carefully and sometimes very deftly by extreme right-wing politicians. The art is doublespeak. You somehow talk about Mexicans as rapists and murderers. Have I said anything wrong? Well, they do rape, and then you withdraw it. So there's a flirtation with racist speech, with hate speech, which you can withdraw. The most beautiful act, maybe, again, because it was wordless, was Elon Musk making 50% of a Nazi salute with his back turned to the audience. So next time he will make 70% halfway turned to the audience. So there's a lot of doublespeak, of gaming going on in these right-wing parties. I need not to go in detail. What I want to go into is this relation between voters who vote for extreme right-wing parties and the people they hate most. I'm not going to talk about we, everybody pays his own bill, I'll talk about me. They don't like me. Why don't they like me? They don't like me because I'm a leftish professor in a big city who has very refined cultural tastes, which, among other things, imply that I hate Humpa music, that stupid music they play. Neither what's music got to do with the war in Ukraine? A whole lot of it. It means that there is a distance between me and what you call popular taste, although there are very many different popular tastes. I'm a cosmopolitan and an internationalist. That's why I come to conferences like these. You know what they're doing at conferences like these? They're drinking champagne at the cost of the taxpayer. That's what they're doing. Are they wrong? Well, they'd be a little disappointed about the way we live, but they're not entirely wrong. So what I'm trying to say is that many people who are not themselves highly educated do not have these refined cultural tastes, who are not open to all sorts of sexual variations which they find bewildering, might think that we condescend to them. Let me give you a great big secret. They're damn right. Because you put the shoe on your foot if you think it fits, but let me speak at my own expense. I spent about 60 years of my life getting educated. Obviously, I value high academic titles, academic achievements. Could that maybe mean that secretly, sometimes I look down on people without diplomas, who haven't written anything, who haven't read anything for the past years? Maybe I sometimes do. Could it be that some people feel insulted and condescended by me? Yes, it could be. So there is a dynamic between this highly educated, relatively well-paid, international-oriented, sexually reasonably liberal kind of people, and I talk only at my own expense. You see what you want to see in it. Yes, I think this is a perverse dynamic going on, and frankly, I don't know what to do entirely to give them the RSPECT, which as human beings they deserve, and not just as human beings. These people have their achievements for which they really made an effort and in the course of their lives. Now let me generalize. This is not going to be an egocentric address. The social democratic parties in Europe suffer exactly from this problem. They from the beginning have been labor parties. Partij van de Arbeid is our party. Somehow they got taken over by intellectuals of my kind and lost touch with what we call working class, for lack of a better denomination. They still stuck to the welfare states and to free education for all and all sorts of these amenities, But somehow the tone changed, and you had to be a doctorandus or an MA to be a representative. I think 80% of the representatives in Dutch Parliament have MAs. By the way, 45% of the Dutch population now does. That was only 10% 50 years ago. So there has been an academization of the population, but that means that another part of the population is left behind. Social democratic parties made themselves, took over the rights of women, the rights of homosexuals, and then a whole slew of other new sexual minorities were embraced. And many people are bewildered. What the hell is this about? But to us, this liberal mentality somehow makes us feel good, makes us feel liberal, enlightened, sophisticated, cool. And some people just don't see what's so good about it. But these people may be succeeding in having a good marriage, notwithstanding all the problems which they somehow cope and manage. They may bringing up their children to be honest citizens. They may doing a fair job and making the best of it. And somehow that is the source of their respect. Let me talk about the idea of the family, but I'll make a little roundabout. In right-wing thinking, the central concept is the Volk. Volk is a German word, which is a loan word in American English or British English, meaning basically the mythified nation. And the folk is an organic concept. It consists of cells, and every cell is a little family. And the family is essential for the survival of the folk. Now, the folk is constantly threatened by other volker, and there is a constant danger. And the folk is threatened by aliens called immigrants. The folk is threatened by sexual perverts who are after your children. The folk is threatened by people who are taking away your pension. And so the family is the unit of defense of the folk. And now I must agree that historically, the core family was a rather recent achievement of the working class. Working class people and rural people, women were working, be it in the fields or as maids in households with all the risks that entails. And once industrialization got underway, many working class people had a wage which allowed them to support their family at the husband's salary alone. He was the breadwinner. And that to them really meant that they were winners. It was an achievement. And their wives did no longer have to be in the streets and go out to work. They could become what we now call homemakers. That was a source of great pride, and historically it still is. And this family is threatened, and therefore the husband is not only a breadwinner, he is also a defender of the family. Now, that is no small thing to say. It means something, and people really make an effort to succeed in those tasks of providing for their family, defending their family. If the man is the head of this, the defender of this core family that is being constantly threatened, it is the wife's task to support him and to follow him. In the meantime, as a homemaker, she has a responsibility of her own, and we never know what's going on in the bedrooms of these couples and who really decides and in all sorts of matters. But to the outside, it's the man who is the breadwinner and the defender, and it is the woman who keeps the home. By the way, now in almost all those working class, middle class families, the woman works until she marries, even during bringing during the upbringing of the children, and certainly after. Women now have independent incomes from their husbands in the vast majority of cases. But the work is more honorable than being in the streets or being a farm worker or being a maid. It is usually a middle-class job. All these things have to do with a feeling of honor, with respect. Now, in this great progressive movement of the late 20th century and the early 21st century, not only were working class parties taken over by intellectuals like me, but feminists became very important in those parties. And the feminist voice, which somebody likes me, supports wholeheartedly. I've written an entire book about it. But feminists tend to belittle homework and tend to make somehow look down a little bit of women who spend most of the time at home, bringing up children, taking care of the household. That is a very dumb thing to do. First of all, if you want males to take care of a greater part of the household, don't tell them that homework is drudgery. No, you should tell them homework is creative, it is exciting, it's responsible. Then we're going to do it. And secondly, you belittle women who invested most of their time, their effort, their empathy, and their love in their household and in their family. Don't do that. So what I see going on, in one word, is a crisis of condescension and respect withheld. And that can make a person very, very angry. So they vote for politicians who exude a certain decisiveness, masculinity. And what is very interesting is the role of women in these right-wing parties. Some of them are being, Meloni, for example, is the leader of an extreme right-wing party who plays a very complicated double role in Europe. Why are extreme right parties against the European Union? Because it dissolves and blends the folk, and therefore it is a non-real, non-vital construct. So the role of women in extreme right-wing parties is something to fascinating. I was losing my own thread. So the right-wing parties exude a certain form of masculinity, even in the way women present themselves. An excellent anthropologist in the Netherlands wrote about Margaret Thatcher and about Merkel that they were honorary men. And he very precisely described how somehow Mr. Thatcher and Mr. Merkel are not there. And often the children were not there. And they wore these, how do you call a broekpak? These suits women politicians wear, you know, with pants.
Pantsuits.
Pantsuits. That is the preferred. It's somehow, it is beyond gender. So these political parties tend to create a certain leader who respects the family, even though he makes a joke of it. Obvious, Trump is not someone who is an outstanding family man. So here, elements of play, of joking, of double talk, of masquerading come in. The relationship of extreme right-wing parties with religion is fascinating. Basically, it is a completely instrumentalized relationship in which Trump was the first Republican candidate and president who honored his promise to fight abortion to the hill. All other Republican presidents promised it and never did a goddamn thing about it. I would be angry if I were a Catholic working class voter. But that was one thing he did. Nevertheless, the relationship is completely instrumentalized. Well, I'll leave it at this point. And I think the central idea is a game of play between involuntary condescension and respect refused. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I think we've heard, yeah, please. We've heard two very different analyses here of what we might call the current disorder, both of which, interestingly, have ended with some suggestion that testosterone might be part of our problem. That, I mean, which is not where I expected, honestly, at the beginning of this discussion. It'd been one of the questions I
think
put down.
the word hubris that
Well,
applies.
yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, considering who we're speaking to, the kind of people who are here, I don't know if Simon is going to continue that theme or whether he's going to look elsewhere at why we are where we are.
Well, you've just said what I was going to say.
Shall I now say what you...
No, joking. So let's start out how you started. So a legal authority, a general with experience of genocide, a sociologist, political scientist, an Aretha Franklin fan, a psychiatrist, and the next generation of political scientists all walk into a bar. And the psychiatrist says, what the fuck am I doing here? Because I know about mental illness and people and things like that. But you just give me the clue. I was listening to the people first, the people speaking on hubris. And I do want to go back to that. And I want to pick up what you just said about predicting the future. Okay. Now, there's a proverb about history that is variously attributed to either Hungarians or Lithuanians or Ukrainians, or indeed any polity that has been under either directly or indirectly under the influence of the Soviet Union. The proverb goes, predicting the future is very easy. Predicting the past is extremely dangerous. And so I want to do that a little bit over what was just said earlier. And this is the concept of hubris, because I did think some of that discussion was a bit ahistorical and could easily be interpreted in a different way, because it did suffer a little bit from the dangers of reading history backwards, of knowing what people don't know, what it has happened, as opposed to what is going to happen. And it's quite easy to describe, and a lot of the talks was actually about individuals, which makes life a bit easier, described what we know did happen, but it might not have done. And if it hadn't done, they would have been seen in a very different way. So we can think of people like Admiral Nelson, who definitely had many of those characteristics but died a hero because his gamble won. We can think about Patton maybe, or Kubla Khan if you want. But the one I did want to think about, first of all, was Winston Churchill, who is generally regarded as the greatest Briton ever for perfectly good reasons. But when he came to power in the spring of 1940, he was widely disliked. He was not popular. He only got the job because a person who should have got the job, Lord Halifax, refused it. And he was regarded as dangerous, he was regarded as quite charismatic, but spoke too much, had a high opinion of himself. But most of all, he was regarded as unsafe, unsound, risky, likely to take terrible decisions that would doom the country. Now, it turned out, for the first 10 days of his rule, he then, despite all his faults, all of which were true, by the way, all of them came to nothing, because he did indeed save the country, and if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be here, and all sorts of other people wouldn't be either. And of course, but had it gone wrong, had his gamble failed, he would most definitely be seen as the ultimate hubris, but he wasn't. And then I want to go back to the other thing, which is you can read a person's biography in a very different way to the way we heard this morning. So in 1952, two very famous politicians were born. Anyone want to guess who they were? We talked about both of them today.
52, Blair?
Pardon? Yeah, Blair, very good. Who's the other one? 1952?
Bush? No.
Not Bush.
No.
No, talked about a lot. Putin, very good.
Putin.
They're both taught, but you can see their history also in a different certain way. And I want to just for a little bit think about Tony Blair. So he was characterized by Eugene, and indeed most people in Britain now regard the decision to go with the Americans, the invasion of Iraq, as being a hubristic decision. But I don't think it was. I think it's entirely explainable in political terms and personal terms about Blair. And if you think about him, and he's talked about this openly, was he grew up as a child, and many of the stories he heard at school and in his formative years were obviously about the Holocaust and what others have described our failure as a great powers to prevent it. And I don't know that we could have done really, but it doesn't matter. He grew up in the same narratives that I did, that here's the first, not the first genocide, but the most extraordinary genocide, and we did nothing about it. By the time he gets to adolescence, he's at university now, of course, he hears, as I did, about year zero and the Cambodian killing fields. We did nothing about it. He's now in politics, and he hears very much about Rwanda, but he's still not in power, but he knows all about it, and he could not possibly know. A third massive failure. And then he actually has a chance to do something about the fourth, which is a civil war in Sierra Leone, where Britain has a kind of old relationship with. He launches Op Barras, a military operation that is incredibly successful and brings the hideous civil war there to an end. And children in Sierra Leone are still called Tony, as a reflection of Tony Blair, not in a sarcastic, ironic way, because there he's regarded as someone who brought a terrible catastrophe for an end. And then comes round 5, Iraq. And Ian has just reminded me as to what Blair did the night before he flies off to meet Bush on his ranch and come to the famous accord that he will do about committing us pretty without reservations to the invasion. What was he reading? He was reading the papers of Neville Chamberlain the night before he goes to see Bush. And for those who don't know, Neville Chamberlain is the Prime Minister before Churchill, now very much reviled as the kind of high priest of appeasement, who famously said in 1938, as we are contemplating going to war with Hitler to the aid of Czechoslovakia, a faraway country of which we know nothing. And that's the faraway country where my father comes from, who was in Prague in 1939 when Hitler invaded and went to see him. I mean, he didn't shake his hands. He saw him in the main square of Hradčany, and everything that followed is obviously catastrophic. So I think that we can go a little bit too far on some of the things we've been talked about. We'll come on to Trump later, won't we? We're always going to come on to Trump. We're always going to do. We'll leave that for a little bit. But just to say, you can see some of the personalities that we've just seen in a different way. History could have turned out differently, and also their motives could have been different. And actually, in Blair's example, rather more honourable, I think, and understandable than, because it was a failure, that we have come to see. So that's it then. Don't read history backwards, and understanding the past can be very dangerous.
Okay, you want to talk about Trump? I'll throw you the ball, because these guys have taken longer than you. I'll give you the ball.
No, let's wait for Trump. Let's wait for Trump.
What would a psychiatrist like to tell us about Trump?
Oh, God. Okay, I'll tell you what I did say about Trump. Okay, so I was president of the Royal Psychiatrists for 3 years, and during that time, every day, journalists were ringing up and saying, could you tell us about Trump, and is he this, that, and the other, and what's his mental disorder? Is it narcissism? You name it, every single disorder in the world, apart from, they are talking about dementia now, aren't they? They weren't talking about dementia then. You name it, grandiosity, manic depression, everything. And finally, I got fed up with this, and I wrote a communication for all our members, all our psychiatrists in Great Britain, and said, please, could we stop talking about Donald Trump whenever we're asked about psychiatry and his psychiatric diagnosis? And I said, obviously, I can't enforce this, but I'd rather that you didn't. And the reason I said was this, and Dan just wrote it just straight off and said that this is not out of concern for the President of the United States, but for concern for those with mental illness, who have enough to deal with already without being compared to Donald Trump. And just to remind you, misogyny, extremism, sexual whatever it is, misconduct, etc., are not signs of mental disorder. Thank you very much. So that went out. Unfortunately, it got tweeted. And then again, everybody retweeted it about, don't talk about Trump because it's not fair on people who do have mental illness. So that's it. He doesn't have a mental illness. It's much better to understand him in the terms of what he is, which in Britain is what we would call a wanker. Much more simple, and that I think explains much more. No, I'm not going to explain it. No, I'm not. I'm definitely not. You'll have to look it up. It is. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yes, it is obscene. Yeah, yeah.
Before I bring Maka in, can I just lob one question to all of you? I'm going to have a whole list of them, but I don't think it's worthwhile doing them all because obviously we want to get round to letting everybody ask questions as well after Maka has asked a few herself. Which is from earlier this morning, there was this idea that somehow humility is the way forward for us all, and particularly for advice for all of the leaders that we have and so on, that this would, I mean, there were other ideas as well, that somehow empathy would solve everything, but maybe if we just look at the top level of leaders and humility. And I wrote down, should we all become Canadian? Essentially, I mean, is this, you know, are Canadians kind of superhumanly humble and really recognize their place in the world, that it's okay to get things wrong, it's okay to say sorry, something that you embody to some degree, General? I mean, is humility maybe the thing that we are lacking most in relation to how the far right operates, Abraham, and maybe in relation to what you were speaking about, Simon? General.
If your whole concept of leadership and of directing whatever construct that you're involved with, whatever discipline, is based on power, is based on rank, is based on position, is based on recognition by both society and those below you, based on a chain of command concept that pushes everything to the top. If you're based on in those premises, then humility is exceptionally difficult to find, because it's simply not rewarded nor nurtured. It's just not there. However, it is my humble opinion that when we lose contact with the human beings that we're involved with, we lose contact with the capability of truly being able to command and influence them and make them grow, as well as the organization, and achieve the missions that you have. And so often we are wrapped up in a whole set of processes that in our world push us away from the desire to be linked in with the human beings, because the rewards and the recognition processes, that was the way I was educated. And so I commanded up to 12,000 troops, but I knew that every one of them had a family. So no matter how many troops I had, every one of them counted. However, that's not necessarily the way that we have been educated to operate. We've been educated to meet and accept, deficiencies and losses and the like. But in my opinion, unless you actually love the human beings in which you are involved with to achieve your mission, you will not be able to sustain your position of authority. And particularly with the new generations of the M's and the Z's and the A's, who the futurists have told us that rank will not count anymore. Just like borders are going to be disappearing, that the automatic reaction of rank is simply not acceptable by those young generations. They do not put the same importance to that sense of identified authority. They feel they can participate fully and engage and be not equal, but being able to be accepted for what they are, and not as a subordinate or as an inferior.
Thank you. Professor Svan. Humility.
I'm breathing. It's such a difficult subject, and I'm thinking about this being humble. In the Catholic Church, that is a main virtue, and you can see the Pope being humble. And it's always a word associated with it. And to somehow, to my remote eyes, it looks hypocritical. So how can one be sincerely humble? I don't know, but maybe we should change the admonition. Not talk about being humble, but trying not to humble others. It's a transitive verb in English. So a humble person maybe is somebody who succeeds in avoiding to humble other people. That is quite an achievement. And and probably the only way to do that is to figure out what somebody else's achievements and merits and virtues are, and what counts for the other guy or the other woman in their life history. Well, I have not. This is as far as I can come in preaching.
But I think what you just got on there was a good point. I think it was Gregory Peck, the actor, said, the secret of great acting is to be sincere. And once you can fake that, you can fake anything. and by the way, Mark Carney ran on I'm Not Donald Trump ticket, and it worked incredibly well. And by the way, before we give way to gloom, around the world in the last few weeks, we've had several people win on the I'm Not Donald Trump ticket in Australia and Romania. I mean, that was a surprise. It really was. So it's not all bad. Oh, it's you and me. Okay. Mark Carney, I met him a couple of times, and he's unbelievably bright and he's absolutely brilliant. I think his staff would not use the word humble to describe him, but he certainly
he's good at the act.
He is, yes. I think that's true, and he was the right man in the right place for all that stuff. But I don't think that would be the word. And similarly with generals. I mean, Montgomery was one of our greatest British generals, and he professed himself to be exactly as you described, Romeo. He said that, and he certainly tried at least to avoid some of the catastrophic tactics of the First World War, but that's as far as it went. And a general who, as empathizing certainly in the way you do, but in the end, he's going to send people and he's going to sacrifice people who he knows are going to have to do something that is likely to lead to quite heavy casualties in them. And that's what a general does.
But he could do that thinking about the individuals.
Well, he could do, but a lot of people might suggest that might also impede his or her these days ability to do the job.
You've got Montgomery, who's got his mannerisms and all his fashions.
That's one way of putting it.
And the complexities of his command and the ambition of his command. Then you got Patton, who's that plus another level, successful, taking risks, and achieving success. But then you've got Bradley. And Bradley had more success, less casualties, and achieved, in fact, the respect of his soldiers that none of the two others ever had.
Good point.
And so, in my opinion, you cannot lead and fake humility. It is impossible because your eyes will call you right to task as a liar, and the troops, in my opinion, can see bullshit a mile away. And so they'll see whether you have the instinct of really not just empathy, but even the extent of love, because you are committing them to potentially put their lives at risk to achieve a mission that you have given them command of. And having commanded troops, lost troops in battle, having seen the mission catastrophically abandoned and failed like I've done, plus the other experiences of Cambodia and so on, unless you can demonstrate that sincerity profoundly, and one of the most profound expressions of that is love.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't be able to express that, be able to handle that you are fallible and that you will make mistakes and that the troops will follow you, even though they know there might be mistakes, but however, in the norm, they know that you're pondered and you've taken all the factors involved and reduced that. If you can't project that, you cannot command. And so the question is, Trump is commanding a world power and he's leading it into hell.
Yep.
I am a graduate of the U.S. Marine Corps Staff College. My classmates all did at least one, if not two, tours in Vietnam. They despised the generals in Vietnam, and they were Marines, because the generals had commanded from a high level and did not get their boots dirty on the ground. Those guys have become mentors of the current generals. They are scared. They are very concerned of what this guy is going to do to the military and make the military do, to the extent that it'll put them, not only take casualties, but create casualties and destroy their reputation and put them into fundamental ethical and moral dilemmas that a responsible political mind would never impose upon its ability to influence through power. And so this era is a era in which I come back to my statement of revolution, because there are all kinds of opportunities going to come out of this. But in the meantime, we're going to take a hell of a lot of casualties and a lot of hits. But stuff is going to come through it, and we'll break through this revolution. The idea of the past, of trying to evolve, trying to change, trying to maybe make reforms, that was fine for the 300 years of Westphalia. Ain't working anymore. It's a new era. So leap into the new era, but don't ever, ever consider that you can do that without human security, ultimately without the human factor being foremost in your decision making. That is what I have educated my subordinates and what I've sort of lived by, but you also live by the traumas that you have to carry for taking decisions with those factors in mind.
Well done.
I'm going to ask Maka now to take us out of where I've left it. And do you have a general question for the whole panel?
No, not just for me.
Yeah.
Or would you like to ask one directly
You
to
just
the
did
general?
the general questions.
Well, first of all, I'm really extremely honored to sit here with you. This was the panel which I got, and I was thinking, how do I prepare for it? Because it's not about Helsinki records only, so I cannot just read about Helsinki records. So I have a set of questions, but of course I will try to squeeze them in. So first, you all mentioned today, and it was mentioned yesterday as well, that we live in very revolutionary period. And as from the perspective of a young person, I can say that this is like this definitely, because me personally, as a Georgian living in Europe, I feel that I live in times where every value and every belief which I had when I was growing up at school in Georgia is shaped. And it's not shaped in a good way. So you mentioned, you talked about what are the reasons of the rise of right-wing parties, why people, why societies in different countries tend to choose like charismatic, masculine men instead of sticking to liberal democracy. And I have answered to that from my perspective, of course, that what the young generation feels like right now is a frustration and disappointment. So first, yeah, like to stick to the question, I want to ask on two main issues. First, for young people who has to build future, but who has to somehow survive this revolutionary period right now, or end of the era, how should we stick to moral stance, which I believe every person needs to survive? And I think, I don't remember who said yesterday that, I think it was in your documentary, General, that every person has to do its maximum in their own field to, in order to make a victory. So first, in the times when we are in an environment where information is coming from all around, and I always believe that the Huxley's book about new brave world is very, very relevant right now, because we receive dozens of information and we don't know whom to trust, like what is true. For example, I will take the example of Middle East conflict because it's much more uncertain for young people right now than war in Ukraine. So what would you suggest how young generation must have some kind of moral stand and do not convey influences which are coming from over the world? And the second one, we talked about institutions, and everyone discussed here the UN, the Helsinki Records, the NATO, the European Union, and so on and so on. And we see that, I don't know, probably many of us participated in model UN, like model European Union, model NATO, to solve some problems. And what we see nowadays, for example, the recent weeks, we see that politicians gather in the same way, but people are keeping dying in Middle East, they are dying in Ukraine, and no country, no US, despite the Trump's promise and despite of anyone's promise, can do anything. So to sum up, and I hope that I will make it clear, for me as a young person who studies politics, two main things are uncertain, very much uncertain. First, the moral stance in these revolutionary times, and the second, the trust. How to rebuild the trust in institutions which we don't have anymore. Like, we know that Security Council in UN exists, we know that institutional court in Hague exists, and it said that, oh, Putin is a person, Putin has to be imprisoned. So what would you advise to us? I don't know, is it challenge or not, but I'm challenging you.
I think it's, I mean, these are just tiny questions, Maka. I mean, really, they're just, so small that, they're great questions. So, how to retain your moral values and how to renew trust in the institutions. Okay, General wishes to answer first.
I think that the younger generation should become activists and seek out, in fact, its references in this very complex and ambiguous era. And so become actively engaged in wanting to seek what those options are and what that moral reference should be. Because what you've got around you is simply complex and ambiguous. And so not waiting for the answer to come from an institution, be it church or whatever, but in fact seeking your references to do that. I think the second dimension of being not only activists is join bodies that are still engaged with the advancement of humanity. For the first time in the world, we can talk to the whole of humanity. You guys have got the communications that you can be real time and coalesce in the world if you are able to articulate it and mature it. So you've got the instruments to be able to be of enormous influence. In the last election, we had 2.9 million votes that were never used, and they were between the ages of 18 and 25, right? That is the balance of power in our democracy. We had an MP elected by one vote, okay? So what I'm saying is that you have instruments out there to be used, but mature them and use them, engage them. And my last point is, it is my opinion that the NGO community will become more mature, stop fighting amongst each other, coalesce, and become the voice of humanity and the eyes and ears of influencing public opinion. Create your own NGO, create your own body, be it international or not. And in so doing, look at your presence or what you are within the realm of humanity, within the realm of the planet, just like the astronauts look at the little ball there and realize that if that planet and humanity don't create a communion, you're not going to be thriving, you're going to be surviving. So shift gears into that realm. That's my short answer.
Professor Svan.
Well, I'm not professor in this, I didn't study it, but I lived through it. That is, I'm thinking, I'm from a generation that when I was in my teens, tens, maybe hundreds of millions of people woke up from the nightmare of National Socialism, which they had believed was a dream. And they were totally at a loss. And then in my family, there was the adieu to communism and the Soviet Empire. And they were completely confused. Then in all this time, there has been a steady secularization, but each person who loses his faith and gains a worldview, you don't just lose, you gain something too. We're in profound crisis, and this still goes on. So you are not the first disoriented generation. You are the generation we all have to deal with now. Your problems are the problems of today. Mine are way back. What do you do when you face an existential problem? My advice is exist. That means let's see what you do. You see things, you hear things, you get angry, you talk to your friends, you do things, you live, and let's see what comes of it. Great advice.
I love that. The advices exist. Well, the opposite is slightly more worrying, isn't it? Anyway, it'd be great if you gave that advice.
Yeah.
I work in a university, being dean of a big faculty and all those kind of things. First thing to say, I don't think it's quite as bad as you think, in the sense that our students seem to be very morally engaged, really very much so in different things to what you've just been talking about, but it's because of our students we've now become completely meat-free against all the advice. We had a referendum. You'd have thought we'd have had enough referendums in Britain, wouldn't you? We had a referendum on what our canteens should serve, and the winner was vegan. So all our canteens are vegan, which I hate. Yeah, you're waving and saying good. But they're really engaged in that, and all of the issues around sustainability are the most important thing. When they're asked what we should be researching, what should be doing, that comes first every time. Our students are protesting against Gaza and all of the things. And the only thing that is, I think, slightly more worrying is when I was at that stage, when in the student union, we were always doing things to annoy the vice chancellor, which meant inviting people who he felt, it was a he, should not be invited on campus. The leader of the IRA being a very good example. And he said, no, that, etc. And now we have slightly the opposite way. I chair our committee on free speech for the university, which is to ensure that people who have abhorrent views are allowed on campus and are not boycotted. And
and then the students protest about it.
Yes, it's the students now. And so we say, for example, Germaine Greer, a very famous feminist, her views on trans are not the views of our students. She's invited to campus and they want her to be disinvited. And we say, no. I mean, you can protest and do everything you want. You can't be violent, but you can protest, of course, but we are not disinviting her. And that's the one area where I see a more censorious generation that are not always prepared to argue against other views. And I also insisted that we had someone who was a genuine Holocaust denier. And for my own family history, this is someone that I do not want on campus, and certainly would not use the word welcome. And I prevented that we gave any refreshments. Mm-hmm. So he was not going to have a coffee or a tea because he was not welcome, but he could come. And I just hope that our students are bright enough to show him to be, I'm going to use the word wanker again, to be the wanker that he is. And you'll probably know who it was. But, I thought it was very important, and that I hope that our students were good enough to show him up for what it was, which in fact, in the end, they were. So that's the one bit that does worry me a little bit. Is and also, and you can see, and I think this is picking up what you were just saying as well, that part of Trump's victory was a more populist reaction against the way and why he's so incensed with the universities. He feels they are pushing causes that he feels are inimical to being a good American, whatever rubbish he says. But I think there's like everything, there's a little bit of truth in that. It's not completely wrong. And a lot of people felt left behind and left out and not in agreement with what universities and their kind of general view of societies are for. So it's not entirely untrue.
I wonder if you raised the point about institutions like the UN. In 2005, Kofi Annan was given, had been given a second mandate to be Secretary General, and it was the Americans that pushed it because they wanted a reform of the UN. And so he produced a list of nearly 100 recommendations of enormous significance of bringing the UN in a far more responsible capability from recruitment to the actual Security Council and so on. An extensive piece of work. 3 months before he presented it to the General Assembly in 2005, one of the members, the P5, vetoed it. You know who it was? It was a guy called Bolton, the white mustache. He was the ambassador to the United States. The Americans who wanted that vetoed against it because they realized that the reforms that he was bringing forward would make the UN another player at the big leagues of the international community. And they didn't want that, really. They wanted to keep a whipping horse and so on. And so the institution as such is not the fallacy of the problem. The institution is the nations that make up the UN that are not giving it the tools and not making the changes and not imposing their will to actually make it an effective instrument to be able to assist us. And so unless those reforms are brought forward, and the only one, I'll end with this, that did make it through was the responsibility to protect. That essentially said, it's no more the sovereign state that's sovereign, it's the individual that's sovereign. That means sovereignty is no more an absolute. And I think that was the greatest absolute, and I've worked and published on the will to intervene. Now that you have a doctrine that says that you have a responsibility to protect people who are being massively abused by their human rights. Nobody wants to use it. And when they did in Libya, they gave it to the UN and to the NATO because the Security Council is not structured to command and control and to do the planning and so on. And so NATO did its normal thing, just blow the living shit out of the place. And that's what it did. And that's why nobody, and the Russians and Chinese are happy to veto it. But it is still the most extensive reform instrument that was brought into the UN, and the countries that make up the UN don't want to use it.
Because, I mean, the G words now is avoided partly because if you would pronounce the G word, or genocide, then there is a responsibility to protect. That was what I think Samantha Power, I think her name is, A Message from Hell, was her argument. And I think it's a very important aspect of the reluctance of governments now to pronounce themselves on Gaza.
There you go. And Samantha Power, however, got bought in by the American government and changed because she was at Harvard when I was there. And from an activist who was going through Chad into Darfur, on her own and changing things, became really a person of the system and ultimately lost that verve that you're just describing there because the system sucked her in. That's what you got to avoid. And you're young enough and have enough information and enough tools that we never had to be able to significant coalesce and bring change.
We have a few minutes now at the end to open up for a few questions. We're going to be, yes, sea of hands already. So let's take from Ian Baruma, if you can reintroduce yourself. People don't know who you are necessarily. Yes.
My name is Ian Baruma. I teach at Bard College in New York. I have a question for Abraham de Zwaan. One thing that complicates your analysis, I think, that people, good family people and so on, with old-fashioned views on sexuality, feel disrespected, is that the red states, the states where Trump got elected with big majorities, have far higher incidences of divorce, drug use, single mother children, broken families, and so on, than states like Massachusetts, which are relatively wealthier and where there's much less than that. And they preferred a rapist who was married many times and liked grabbing women by the pussy to a devout Catholic family man. So there must be another reason for this. And I think it may be something else you said, this bewilderment about a changing world. And it has to do with class, and it has to do with secularization, that we still remember a period in which people knew their places, class-wise, gender-wise. They went to church, they did as the priest or whoever it was told them to do. That all started disappearing really in the 60s because of our generation who wanted it to disappear. And instead of privilege being a matter of birth and so on, it became a matter of merit, university education and that sort of thing. So the new elite is meritocratic, but what makes it worse is that it then takes on the badge of superior virtue. And the superior virtue is believing in all the right things about gender and sexuality and so on. I think that is perhaps a better reason than nice family people with old-fashioned values being disrespected for that.
Thank you. Can we take the other gentleman at the back there? I see.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank Robert and his team. This is the most brilliant address to the biggest problem we have as a species on the planet, not the threat of nuclear war. Or
can you put the microphone a little closer to your mouth, please?
Yes.
Yeah, you got an artillery officer sitting here.
Thank you.
Okay, so
And
the biggest problem.
and introduce yourself to
Okay,
those who don't know
I'm
you.
a scalable psychologist and a movie producer. I've made movies you've all seen before, but my activities are dedicated purely to social impact.
Yeah.
Okay, how about that?
Perfect.
Okay. No, so I've given a few speeches myself. So the biggest challenge that we have as a species from my position and respect is the lack of mental health on a scalable basis. I'm a scalable psychologist myself. My background is psychotherapy. And, but I didn't want to reach 1,000 people over 40 years. I wanted to try to reach 100 million that could then expand. The application of military strategy or the integration of military thinking with addressing mental health as a source of war is brilliant. Elon Musk said recently that empathy is overrated. Earlier today, Simon said that maybe it's not evil, it's the lack of empathy. Autism is on the rise. Darwin would suggest, and I remain an optimist despite all this craziness, because Darwin says that natural selection is at play right now. Where is this that we can go towards thrive versus survive as a species? Why is empathy a cornerstone of this conversation? And what can we all do as intellectuals, exclusive of myself, of course, but people with impact to try to reach all those other folks that are massified around more primitive behaviors, primordial behaviors, might makes right. What do we do if we're in the media or we have access to lots of eyeballs? What can we all do to make a difference? And where is humanity going? Just a little question.
Thank you. Can you hand the microphone here, please, to this gentleman there? So we'll just take these 3 questions.
Oh, okay, thank you. The name is Michael Roschürmann from Germany. I'm basically researching in the field of moral and violence. So
could you make it a little closer? Thank you.
Closer? Good?
Yes,
okay.
Perfect.
So I wanted to answer a bit to what you said. So is testosterone the baddie? So I'm trying to defend testosterone a bit. But starting with oxytocin, which everybody loves because it's the cuddling hormone, there was quite an interesting research in the Netherlands where they had games being played, and then they gave people shots of oxytocin. And what they found out is, under oxytocin, people cheated less. They were more empathic. Until you start putting in players with the names Hans and Ahmad. So Arabic or German names. Yeah. Why? Because oxytocin makes you more empathic towards your own group and more racist towards the other group. So testosterone makes mammals want to be alphas. So it makes us search for status. But it's not being bullied. So for example, in bonobos, the most testosterone high males, they are the most conformative, the most cooperative towards the females, because in bonobo society, this gives you status. So there is no straight line between our psychological programming. And also, I would argue, this comes from humans are being basically groupish creatures. So because being groupish, being cooperatives is our evolutionary niche, this helps us. So we are programmed to be groupish, but we also live in 2 realities. There's a physical reality and there's the societies we create. So the question is, I mean, I would say we are definitely our worst enemy because we killed other all other big predators. There's no other enemies for us. But the question is not how much testosterone do we have or what moral values we follow, but what kind of society do we create and which kind of behavior do we reward? Thank you.
Okay, so we have three very different sorts of questions here about what kind of behavior we should be rewarding in society, about what we can actually do to reach others, and the suggestion that maybe it's to do with the meritocratic elite's sense of superiority that is causing the problem. So please take any of the questions any of the answers that you wish to take. I'll take General Dallaire to start with.
I'll take the second one in regards to the population and so on. It was said earlier on, Rita Franklin, I think you said, who spoke of respect. I totally agree that respect means that we're treating each other as equals. We may have frictions of some nuances between us, and nuances to me are religion and races and so on. That's nuances to the fact that we're all equal human beings. There's not one of us that's more human than the other. Not one of us. But to achieve that, you got to respect every human being. And to me, to reach respect means eliminating from your lexicon the word tolerance. Because people get away with the word tolerance. I tolerate. Who the hell are you to tolerate somebody else? And so shifting gears to the higher plane of respect that has no limits, because you're treating the other as a human being, whether they're educated, whether they're whatever problems they may have, whether they're elitist and the like. You treat them as human beings, and it's the resolution of those frictions that permit humanity to advance. But the refusal to communicate that's where I think we break down, is we just refuse to communicate with the other. We refuse to establish a link with the other human being because we've decided that the other human is not as human as us. And that pretentiousness is the basis of so much of the frictions that lead to the extremes that we've seen in conflicts.
I just want to throw a spanner in the works at that point, because we tried that at our university, and so did Cambridge, and so did Oxford. And when we came up with our new rules for free speech, we talked about that students should respect all other views. And there was an enormous pushback. And indeed, the vice-chancellor of the university had to resign at Cambridge because he had written this.
Was it to do with the interpretation of the rules? Or?
No, it was to do with the word respect. And we did change it to tolerate, because I don't respect I don't respect the guy who's a Holocaust denier. I don't respect him. I certainly don't. But we should tolerate that opinion on campus and oppose it. And you should look it up. It led to the vice-chancellor at Cambridge resigning over the word respect. The pushback was enormous, and most universities have changed their codes on free speech not to insist that students respect some views, because some of them just don't and won't, and it's not for us to say they shouldn't, but it is for us to say, but you must tolerate those opinions, and if necessary, confront them and argue with them and debate them. And that one got through. So
I bring the argument respect to a higher plane than opinions and actions and religious beliefs and all that.
Yeah,
I believe
take that, Romeo.
related to the fact of a human being.
I know. I don't think anyone said they weren't human beings, but I say the word respect, that our students are obviously of your generation, etc., really, really did not accept that.
Interesting.
And all of us had to change our codes.
I want to bring Abraham in here because this word tolerance.
Yeah.
As I became slightly Dutch via marriage, tolerance was one of the things that was always spoken about as being an inherently Dutch characteristic, which essentially meant not caring about what the others did rather than respecting them. So if you would like to take that, or if you would like to respond to Ian's point, then please, or both.
I'll do both. Well, when I think of tolerance or verdraagzaamheid, it means I sort of shrug my shoulders, put myself in zero emotionality, and let it come over me. If I talk about respect, I would be searching for cues, for little things that made me suddenly think of the other guy as someone like me, or someone I would have liked to be, or somehow I can appreciate. And sometimes you cannot find such points. I completely agree with General Dallaire that we have a basic idea: all human beings are of equal worth or value, whatever that may mean, but it is our one metaphysical statement. So tolerance is close up your emotions, just let it come over you. Respect would be a search for something you find in the other guy. Hey, now I recognize it. That's a little bit like me, or like I would have wanted to be. Something to admire, something to appreciate. And sometimes you can't find it.
And a quick comment on...
Yeah, what Jan says, he very rightly quotes statistics about the most Republican parts of the United States, where the misery is even worse, and there's a lot of addiction and divorce, etc. But that does not mean that these people do not hold family values. They just fail at it, and may blame themselves even more for it. But I'm talking at such a general level that it's hard to contradict the discourse with facts, which is an autocritique, not a critique of you. We would have to go into this conversation about what exactly is going on there, and I would be forced to be more specific. It's what you call a panel risk.
Simon, can I leave the last word with you? Would you like to discuss what kind of behavior we want to reward, or would you like to pick up something else?
Well, I'm staring at the question that we've been asked: are we our own worst enemy? And we haven't actually asked that, have we?
That was my prediction.
Yeah. Well, the answer is we definitely are our own worst enemy, and the whole history of psychology is all about how rubbish we are at virtually everything we think. Daniel Kahneman's stuff on thinking slow and fast shows that most of the decisions we take are usually irrational and are usually driven by emotions, not logic. And the emotions, particularly fear, anger, etc., can be extremely damaging to our well-being and how we behave. So the answer is that, are we our worst enemy? Indisputably, yes.
Well done. Thank you. Well,
I'm one of my own best friends also.
Yeah.
Well, that's another mistake.
As you can tell, it is so difficult to stop the discussion at this point, but I do believe it is time. Robert, would you like to tell us what happens next? And should we do a round of applause for the...
Thank you very much for this panel, and thank you for answering the question, Simon. So this is the end of the 15th International Sakharov Conference. You know, for me, I mean, the discussions were absolutely fantastic. Panels were great, speeches were great, audience was great. For me, something really special is this new edition, the Young Challengers. And I need to be a little bit careful because my new rector is sitting in the audience. I started teaching 12 years ago at Vytautas Magnus University. I never wanted to teach. When I studied in Amsterdam, I didn't take the diploma on teaching because I was afraid that if I would be out of a job, they would force me to become a teacher. And I didn't want to do that. So I was tricked into this by a friend, our joint friend, who died, unfortunately, 8 years ago, Leonidas Donskis, who told me that when I wrote my memoirs, he said, let's turn it into a dissertation. I said, no, this is memoirs, it's not a dissertation. No, we'll change it into a dissertation. I said, listen, Leonidas, if you want a dissertation, you'll get a dissertation. So I wrote a dissertation. He was the chair of my committee. I passed, and then he turned around and said, now you can teach at my university. So I was tricked into this. And I love it, because what I now can do is I can identify what I call agents of change. I can educate them, I can stimulate them. I can work on the new generations who have to take over. And so all these young challengers are my former students, right? One of the speakers was also my former student from South Korea. And so I'm really proud to see them, and I see how they're functioning and participating. And in a couple of years, I don't have to invite speakers anymore because we will have panels of only former students. So I would like to thank you all for being here. Well, I would like to thank my young challengers, of course, but I would like to thank you all for being here and for those who follow the conference online. Everything has been recorded. It will be put on the website, both of the Andrei Sakharov Research Center and of the Federation Global Initiative on Psychiatry. And so you can follow the, the discussions and the presentations which you might have missed. I would like to thank the donors and the partners with whom we have organized this conference. The hub at Shevchenko National University in Kiev. I would like to thank the interpreters because without them this is really an impossibility. So yesterday I showed you the visual of the next conference that we will be organizing on September 18. It's the 8th Leonidas Donskis Memorial Conference. Can I have the visual of the next conference, the Sakharov Conference? So this one will take place exactly a year from now. Also a complicated subject, and I hope that it will be a conference with as many discussions as now. I understand it all looks very dark, pulling back from the abyss, authoritarianism on the rise. As I said yesterday at drinks with the speakers, it's all very dark, but keep in mind there is light at the end of the tunnel. The question is only how long the tunnel is going to be. So thank you for being here. If you could leave your headsets, please, and then take everything with you outside because this room will be changed completely for the closed session, which starts afterwards. So for the speakers, there's lunch. At 2 o'clock, for those who have been invited to the closed session, we will be serving coffee, and we will start on 2:30 sharp. Thank you very much, and see you next year.